Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another episode of Ask the Expert North Texas. I'm Kristen Diaz.
David Rankin. Last week, Love Field saw more than 1,000 off-duty pilots lining the streets for a picket against pilot shortages and flight cancellations. This week, hundreds of Delta pilots are planning to do the same thing ahead of the 4th of July weekend. They're demanding more money. They want better working hours. On today's Ask the Expert, we're joined by Mike Hatten. He's a former airline pilot himself and an expert on the aviation industry, and he is in the KRLD Zoom room. Mike, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me.
We talk about flight cancellations and how it has, in some cases, ruined a lot of summer vacations. How frustrating is it for pilots that flights get canceled like they have been lately?
Well, it's very frustrating for pilots. The number one reason I would say that is that we understand how devastating that can be for the traveler, the people who use our service that pay our salaries. So we're very attuned to it.
Just like, we hear about flight attendants sometimes that get stranded in a city. A pilot can get stranded if a flight or schedule delay or cancellation happens. You guys are always trying to fly back home, ultimately just as much as the passengers are, right?
Well, that's correct. And thank you for bringing up about the flight attendants, because people forget them a lot. They're the customer-facing people in the airline. They have the first and the last opportunity to make someone have a really good flight. But yes, they get stranded trying to get to work. That contributes to delays and cancellations if someone misses their commuting flight, to get to work. Something like, I think 70 to 80% of airline employees commute to work, at least the flight crews.
One thing that we hear a lot about lately are pilot shortages. How severe is the pilot shortage right now?
Well, it's actually very severe, and it's exacerbated by things like convective activity around the country. Florida's probably the number one place for thunderstorms to build in the summer, so we might expect this to get worse. And there are several reasons for this for shortage, and there are solutions also, but that's the good news.
What are some of the reasons for the shortage?
Well, probably the top of the list is the age 65 mandatory retirement rule. This was age 60 about 8 to 10 years ago. They raised it to age 65. And the pilots, or the airlines, used to hire pilots back in the 80s and 90s in waves. And what I mean by that is they would hire for 4 or 5 years, then they wouldn't hire for several years. So everybody was hired in the same age group. Now, this is the decade where all of those retirements are coming at the same time in waves. 50% of the airline pilots that are working today in the United States will retire by the end of the decade.
Wow, the shortages are just going to get worse. Now, the airlines also would hire a lot of ex-military as pilots. Have they seen the numbers of pilots leaving the military to join airlines? Has that dropped?
That has dropped, and you're absolutely correct. It's an excellent point. When I got hired back pre-2000, it was about 50% of the pilots came from the military, about 50% came from the civilian world. Now, the military has increased their pay. It's gotten better, but they've also increased the mandatory commitment to become a pilot. It's in the 10, 12-year range by the time someone pays their commitment back. Now they're close to the 20-year point where they get a retirement. So they have to make a decision whether it's in the best interest to go ahead and retire and go to the airlines at that point. So that has slowed down significantly.
The hiring process takes time in any industry. How long does it take to get a pilot on board? And how much of that time is part of the problem in refilling all of the retirees' open vacancies?
Kristen, that's an excellent question. And it takes anywhere from about 6 to 10 years for someone starting today with zero flight time, zero experience, to gain the level of experience to get to the airlines. There are people that can do it sooner than that with incredible commitment, with large sums of money that they can throw at it to train faster. But that's an average that I gave you. The airlines have proposed some solutions. Many of the major airlines are starting their own academies, and they're trying to reduce that time to about 4 years. And it looks like they're going to be fairly successful at it, but that's still quite a long time.
I was just going to ask you about the fact that a pilot will either come from the military to get their training, or they have to do it on their own in a lot of cases. I've got a friend that started flying just a little Piper Cub, and then she got into teaching herself, and now she's in training to become a regional pilot. Is there any kind of movement towards developing pilots in colleges?
Yes, there are universities around the country that do that. I was a senior training manager of fleet training for the wide body fleets at an airline before I retired. And I was a beneficiary, by the way, of the early retirements offered by COVID. That's another factor contributing to the pilot shortage. However, these universities have degree programs where they can get student loans for these. And when I was at the airline, I would have interns who come to intern in my training department, and some of them had student loans, student debt in the $150,000, $175,000 range.
It's definitely not cheap to become a pilot. Is that also kind of make it for slim pickings on who can become a pilot just because of the socioeconomic background or platform that they have going into learning this trade?
It absolutely does. And there are airlines who are working to change that, to overcome that. United Airlines has announced this Aviate program that they have, as have all the other airlines. But United has said that in the next decade, 50% of their hiring is going to be minorities and women, minorities from that community. And they've made a commitment to that. And they are working to do that as we speak. And the way they're doing this to shorten the time is they bring someone into their system with zero time. They teach them to fly, get them their private license commercial instrument. When they get enough time to be hired as a regional pilot, they move them straight into the regional carrier that serves that airline. Well, guess what that does? Now you get a chance to interview that person for a couple, 3 years on the job and see how they fit. It does another thing. It trains these people from day one to the standard operating procedures of that airline. And standardization is everything in an airline. So by the time they progress through the regional carrier to the mainline carrier, they are well-versed in standard operating procedures. And the person in the left seat, the captain in the commercial airliner, knows exactly how that person is going to fly, exactly what they're going to do. They know and share the same terminology. It reduces the training time. And I always get asked if that is safe. I think it's actually a safer proposition to have trained and interviewed that person for several years.
Is being a pilot still a great career? You know, years ago, pilots were always looked up to. The spiffy uniform and just the commanding presence through an airport.
It's a great career. It's been great for me. I would not discourage anyone from it. It has gotten harder over the years. You know, it really depends on if your glass is half full or empty. I always say mine's always full because half of it is always air. So, but anyway, no, I would recommend it highly. Pilots are professionals. They go into it for a variety of reasons, and they spend a lot of time in education, continuing education, and it's a very rewarding career. I always told pilots that I was training, you know, every time you get on an airplane, speaking of delays and cancellations, you know, make sure you've done your due diligence, because somebody in the back of that airplane is flying for the first time. Someone's traveling to a wedding. Someone's traveling to a graduation. Someone is traveling overseas to see a relative they may never see again. So, you know, just keep that in mind as you're going through your due diligence, planning your flight.
1,000%. I'm the nervous flyer here. I love to travel, but I'm always nervous when I get on a plane. So when we talk about these types of things, I think there are a lot of listeners who might have the same, you know, just generic questions of, like you said, safety. You think that the training, you know, and the way that they're trying to streamline it is a better option. And that's exciting to know. But one thing that makes me a little nervous, and we talk about the standards and you know, what you've been used to in your career of being able to enjoy this, you know, this job, that's changed a bit with the overtime and the stress right now. There's a lot more stress that these pilots are dealing with because of these changes, because of these cancellations, because of COVID, because of people retiring. We've seen already some pilots go on strike. Delta pilots are expecting to also be picketing. Tell me about what it is that's not being heard, because really we want to make sure that our pilots are happy and that they're safe, right?
Well, that's exactly right. And so the way that airlines are getting through this shortage is they are using tools in their quiver, arrows that are in their quiver, in their contracts being the quiver, to offer overtime, to offer mandatory junior manning. That means the junior most person on the seniority list gets calls, and if he answers the phone, he has to do a trip. But in some cases, they can even offer triple pay to do that. Now, what this does is this flies you right up to your maximum time limits. You work the maximum days in a month you're allowed to work contractually and by the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority. And it's getting tough. People are getting tired. Some are leaving the industry because of that. They've changed careers because of it. You mentioned one thing about the pilots picketing. Right now, it's only informational picketing. They haven't initiated any kind of a strike yet. That's actually illegal under the Railway Labor Act until they've gone through all the collective bargaining, arbitration, and have been released by the arbitrators to strike. Now, transportation is very, very important to the economy in the United States. The last strike, formal strike, I think, was during Bill Clinton years. So that tells you how long ago it was. And that strike lasted about 12 minutes before that he ordered the pilots back to work. So it's very difficult to actually strike. What Delta and Southwest have done is informational picketing. It's designed during heavy traffic periods. It won't slow the travel down, but it's designed for the most travelers to see their picket signs and what they're facing.
You mentioned the fact that there are careers switching, that there are going to be pilots that are joining airlines, but those pilots in some cases are coming from other industries as well. And that's going to cause a shortage in those industries.
Yes. I'll give you an example of one. Helicopter pilots. That's how I started out in the United States Army. Go Army. And that's, what I did. And then I left to go to the airline. Well, now helicopter pilots who have enough flight time in an airplane to get hired by the airlines are leaving their helicopter jobs. This is going to affect a lot of different industries. Helicopters are used extensively in construction to haul heavy equipment to remote sites. Helicopters are used by the news agencies, such as yourselves, and different TV stations around the country. And the way they benefit the community is many times they're the eyes of law enforcement before law enforcement can get on the scene. They inform the public about things that might be harmful to their health, so the public can, tune in to see what to do to avoid harm for themselves. And also medevac pilots. We saw yesterday the Amtrak accident. There were in rural Missouri, there were 8 medevac helicopters flying people back and forth to a level 1 trauma center. And where that's important is they call it the golden hour. If you get to a trauma center within 1 hour, your chance of survival goes way up, to a full recovery goes way up.
Absolutely. You talked about the max hours allowed to fly. Pilots are like truckers on the road, right? They have to have mandatory rest. And how many hours can they fly?
It's a sliding scale. It's a great question. It depends on if you're domestic. It depends on if you are flying internationally. It depends on if you're flying early morning. It depends on if you're flying evening. The max, usually a domestic flight would be a traveler in the U.S. would be affected by what you could consider 8 hours, and they have to have 10 hours rest. And again, that can change based on times of day, but 10 hours of rest is called behind the door time. Also, it's the time that you shut your hotel door until you open it again in the morning. It's not, it doesn't include your transportation time.
I was going to ask, what if there's a delay? If they're, delayed for a couple of hours, is that considered rest time, or are they still on the clock?
No, they're still on the clock. You may have, many of your viewers, listeners may have been at an airport where that they had a 7 a.m. flight, and they get there and they say the flight is delayed until 7:04 because the crew can't fly yet. It's because of rest. That 4 minutes doesn't seem like much, and I understand the frustration, and I've seen, been in the gate area and heard people say, what is 4 minutes going to do? That is a very strict limitation imposed by federal law, by the FAA, that it has to be that certain number of hours.
How long is this pilot shortage going to last realistically?
Well, certainly through the end of the decade, demand is high. 2023, I believe it is, American has the highest number of retirements. In other words, they peak. I think 2023 to 2024 is where Delta peaks. 2026, Southwest and United peak. So, we're going to see shortages at least through then. And it's an incredible number. I've read shocking numbers worldwide.
Is there anything else you think our listeners could benefit from knowing, just the inside works of what the pilots are going through right now?
Yes, and I would say, there's hope, and please know that the pilots, and myself being a pilot for many years, we want you to get to your destination. We want you to enjoy flying. We want to share with you the enjoyment that we get out of flying, so you see it maybe through us. So we're vested in seeing that you have a good flight. So what can you do? What is a solution that you can do to help yourself? The best thing I tell people to do is try to book early morning flights, because the bad weather hasn't started then. The thunderstorms haven't fired up. The flights are full then, but here's a little secret. Guess what? A lot of people oversleep and don't make their flights. So that's the best time to make sure you get on the plane and get a good seat. App. Check the app for your airline and make sure you have the most current update. These apps have gotten really good, and here's how that app can benefit you. So let's say you were in Florida, in Orlando, Florida, and you're flying to, let's say, Chicago. So the weather is perfect in Chicago. The weather's perfect in Orlando, Florida, but your flight's delayed. You say, how can my flight be delayed for weather? So that app will tell you that the flight who's coming to Orlando to pick you up and take you to Chicago is coming from Dallas, we'll say. Well, if the weather is bad in Dallas, that plane may get delayed coming out. If it's delayed long enough, the crew on that airplane will run out of duty time for the day, possibly. We talked about duty time earlier. So in years past, when there were plenty of pilots, that pilot would just be replaced by a reserve. It took just a matter of time, short period of time. Now, there may not be a reserve because of the shortage. So that can lead to a longer delay and even a cancellation. And that's where you see the problems run in. So check those apps. The apps sometimes offer to change you to another flight, and you wonder, why are they doing this? That's a clue. You should investigate that. Talk to an agent, ask why that is, and have a plan. Don't be afraid to act if they recommend it.
Mike Hatten is an ex-airline pilot and an expert on the aviation industry. Mike, thank you so much for the time.
Thank you. I really appreciate the time. And you know what? Have a great day, the rest of you, to both of you.